The mediator set her coffee down. That was the thing Layla would remember later. Not the lawyer's face, not Tom's expression, not even the sound of the document landing on the table. Just the coffee cup, placed very carefully onto its coaster, as if the woman had decided she needed both hands free for whatever came next. Tom's attorney had been speaking in that particular tone lawyers use when they are confident. Not loud, just certain. He'd been outlining Tom's position on the marital assets, the property, the timeline of the marriage's deterioration. He used the word deterioration. Layla had written it down in the margin of her notepad because she thought it was interesting that he'd chosen that word. As if a marriage were infrastructure, and the fault was in the material, not the architect. Then Layla's attorney slid the document across the table. It was 47 pages, single-spaced, organized by category, then by date, then cross-referenced in an appendix that Layla had spent one Tuesday evening in February color-coding, because she is, as she will tell you plainly, organized. Tom looked at the cover page for a long time. His attorney looked at the cover page for a shorter time, then looked at Tom. The mediator picked her coffee back up, then put it back down again. Here's what you need to understand before we go any further. Tom was not a monster. This is important because the story is harder to understand if you start there, if you hand yourself a villain and stop looking. Tom was charming. Tom was funny. Tom was the kind of man who remembered the names of waitstaff and gave genuinely thoughtful gifts and cried at his brother's wedding in a way that made everyone trust him a little more. He was also a man who, somewhere in the early years of his marriage to Layla, had developed an extensive private framework for how their life together should work, and had never once called it that. He called it what makes sense. He called it being realistic. He called it, when Layla pushed back, just trying to keep things stable. The rules were never written down. That was the elegance of it, though Tom would not have used that word. They were simply established, understood. The kind of thing that, if you tried to name it in a conversation, Tom could look at you with genuine bafflement and say, "I never said that was a rule. I don't know why you're making this into a thing." The first rule Layla noticed, really noticed, in the way where something snaps into focus and then you cannot unsee it, was about money. They had a joint account. Standard. What was less standard was that any personal purchase over $100 required, as Tom put it, a conversation first. Not permission. He was always careful about that word. Just a conversation. Just transparency. Just, weren't they a team? Layla was a team player. She had a conversation first. The first time she didn't, she bought a coat, a good one, on sale, $240, because her old one had a broken zipper and it was November. Tom did not yell. He never yelled. He went quiet in a particular way, and that evening he asked her, gently, if she'd forgotten they'd talked about this. She said she didn't realize a coat counted. He said he just wished she'd mentioned it. He said he wasn't angry, just a little hurt. Layla returned the coat. She told herself it wasn't a pattern. She had no evidence yet. She was still in the part of the story where you give the benefit of the doubt because you love someone, and love, when it is real, comes with a long runway for second chances. But Layla, as I said, is organized. The document started 18 months into the marriage, not as a weapon, not as evidence, as a private ledger, the kind a person keeps when they are trying to decide if what they are experiencing is real or imagined. A list of moments that felt like rules, with dates, and what was said, and how she had responded, and what happened when she didn't comply. The categories had grown over 8 years. Money, social, family, schedule, language, because yes, there was a section on language, on the words Tom preferred she not use in front of his colleagues, the topics he thought were better left for private, the version of Layla he found most comfortable to present. She had never planned to use it. That's the part that matters. She had kept it for herself, to stay sane, to have something solid to hold on to in the moments when Tom looked at her with that baffled expression, and she started to wonder if she was the problem. She had not kept it for a Tuesday in a mediator's office, and yet, there's something about that document, the fact of it, the shape of it, that I want you to hold on to. Because in a few segments, it's going to become something none of them expected. Not even Layla. The money rule was the first. It was not the last. Rules, when they are not called rules, have a particular way of multiplying. They grow in the gaps between conversations, in the silences after a disagreement, in the careful adjustments a person makes to avoid repeating the thing that caused the quiet. You don't notice the accumulation at first. You notice a change in yourself, a new habit of checking, of pre-clearing, of thinking through Tom's likely response before you make a decision. You think this is consideration. You think this is what it looks like to be a good partner. Layla thought that for a long time. The social rules came next, and these were subtler, which is to say, they were harder to argue with. Tom didn't tell her who she could and couldn't see. He would never have said something so blunt. What he did was develop opinions, strong, consistent, fondly expressed opinions about her friends. Her college roommate Priya was a lot. Her work friend Dana had that energy, you know the one. Her cousin Bex, the one Layla had grown up with, the one she'd shared a bedroom with every summer until she was 16, was kind of a bad influence, don't you think? She's always pushing you toward drama. Bex was not a bad influence. Bex was funny and warm and had been through a brutal divorce 2 years prior, which meant that Bex, more than almost anyone in Layla's life, was in the habit of saying things plainly and without decoration. Tom did not care for Bex. Over the course of 3 years, the shape of Layla's social life reorganized itself, not by instruction, by friction. Seeing Priya required a debrief afterward that Layla found exhausting. Suggesting drinks with Dana reliably produced a comment about the last time they'd gone out and how Layla had come home in a mood. Visiting Bex, who lived 40 minutes away, became a negotiation that Layla increasingly didn't have the energy to navigate. So she saw Bex less. Then rarely. Then on birthdays and in moments of crisis only. She told herself this was what happened when you grew up and got serious about your life, that friendships naturally thinned, that this was normal. She wrote it down anyway. The family rule was the one that broke something open in her, though she wouldn't name it that way for years. Tom got along with her parents, technically, pleasantly even. He was polite at dinners, helpful when her father had a health scare, reliable at holidays. What he was not was available. Her parents lived 3 hours away. In the early years of the marriage, Layla had visited every 6 weeks or so. By year 4, it had become, without any single explicit conversation she could point to, roughly 4 times a year. Not because Tom said she couldn't go, because going required coordination, and the coordination always surfaced a scheduling conflict, or a concern about the timing, or a quiet observation that she'd just been there, hadn't she? And was everything okay? Was there something she needed from her parents that she wasn't getting at home? He could make generosity sound like a question, and a question sound like a diagnosis. Layla's mother noticed. She didn't say anything directly. She was not a woman who inserted herself, but she started calling more often, just to talk, and she lingered on the phone a little longer each time. And once, exactly once, she said, "You sound tired in a way that isn't about sleep." Layla said she was fine. Her mother said, "Okay, sweetheart," in the specific tone that means, "I hear you and I'll be here when you're ready." She wrote that down too. The document by year 5 was 31 pages. Layla had added a summary column to each entry, a one-line note about how the incident had been explained away. She had not planned the summary column. She added it because she was noticing a pattern in the explanations. They were consistent in a way that felt almost architectural. The explanation was always about her sensitivity, her tendency to catastrophize, her habit of making things into something they weren't. Tom delivered these observations with such evident concern, such apparent investment in her well-being that she often found herself thanking him for being honest with her. She wrote that down too. The thanking him part. She underlined it. There was no single moment when Layla decided to leave. That is not how it works in a marriage like this one. There was instead a long, gradual brightening, the way dawn works, where the sky has been getting lighter for an hour before you realize it's morning. She would look at a situation and feel the familiar preemptive adjustment beginning in her chest, the recalibration, the reaching for Tom's likely temperature. And then, slowly, she started catching herself doing it, naming it, writing it down, and then sitting back and reading what she had written. 47 pages by the time she filed, organized by category, cross-referenced, color-coded. She had still not decided what she was going to do with it. And that detail, the fact that she genuinely hadn't planned this, is the one that makes everything that happens in that mediation room land the way it does. When Layla told Tom she wanted a divorce, he cried. This is not unusual. This is not evidence of anything. People cry when their marriages end, and the crying does not tell you whether the grief is for the person or for the arrangement. Layla had expected the tears. What she had not expected was what came after them. The speed of it, the fluency, the way Tom seemed to locate, within about 48 hours, a completely coherent, alternate version of their 8 years together. In Tom's version, Layla had been pulling away for years. He had noticed, but hadn't wanted to pressure her. He had tried. God, he had tried. But she was never quite present, never quite satisfied. And he had done everything he could think of to make her happy, and it was never enough. He told this to his brother first, then his parents, then his work friends, then, in a slightly more polished form, to the couples they'd socialized with together. He didn't badmouth Layla exactly. He was too careful for that. He expressed sadness. He used words like tried and patient and for years. He let people draw their own conclusions. Layla heard about this third hand, through a friend who'd run into Tom's colleague at a birthday party. The friend texted her, "Just so you know, people are getting a version of this." Layla read the text, set her phone down, and went back to the spreadsheet she'd been building for the appendix. She was not performing calm. She was genuinely calm. This surprised her, the solidity of it, the way the ground felt firm under her feet in a way it hadn't in years. She would think about this later and understand that the calm was the document, not what it contained, just the fact of its existence. 47 pages of her own handwriting told her, in a way that no conversation ever had, that she had not been imagining things. Tom's narrative continued to circulate. It became, in the way these things do, the accepted version among people who only had access to one side. Layla didn't correct it. She had been in enough rooms with Tom to know that correcting the narrative directly would only produce a counter-narrative, and the counter-narrative would be warmer and more detailed and delivered with more visible emotion than anything she could manage, because Tom was very good at emotion, and Layla, under stress, went still. Still reads as cold. Cold reads as guilty. She knew this, so she went still, and she waited. There is something specific happening here that I want you to sit with for a second. Tom is not lying exactly. His pain is probably real, but watch what he's doing with it. He's moving first. He is building the record before any record can be built against him. This is not strategy in a calculated sense. It's instinct. It is what someone does when they know, on some level, that the official version of events matters. When you've spent 8 years controlling the marriage inside a marriage, you know exactly how much the narrative matters. The divorce proceedings began in April. Tom had retained a well-regarded family attorney, the kind with a reassuringly expensive office and a manner that suggested he had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. Layla's attorney was less architecturally impressive, but had, as she put it during their first meeting, a particular interest in documentation. Layla had liked her immediately. The first 2 sessions were largely procedural: assets, timelines, the house. Tom's position was clear. The marriage had deteriorated due to incompatibility. Both parties bore some responsibility. A clean split was in everyone's interest. His attorney was smooth. He used the word amicable several times. The implication, stated just obliquely enough to be deniable, was that Layla had been emotionally checked out of the marriage for some time, a point that, if accepted, would frame the dissolution as mutual and minimize the need to examine the internal mechanics of the 8 years in any depth. Layla's attorney let this proceed for a while. She asked clarifying questions. She took notes. She nodded in the way that lawyers nod when they are not actually agreeing with anything. Then, in the 3rd session, she slid the document across the table, 47 pages. The cover sheet said, "Marital Conduct Record, compiled by Layla, surname, January 2016 through November 2023. Tom's attorney picked it up, flipped to the first section, read for approximately 90 seconds. Then he set it down, picked up his pen, and wrote something on his notepad that he angled away from the room. Tom had gone very still. Not the kind of still that Layla went, a different kind. The kind that happens when something has entered a room that you did not put there and cannot explain away. His attorney looked at him. Tom looked at the document, and Layla, for the first time in a very long time, felt absolutely no urge to fill the silence. Hold on to that silence, because what happens inside it, the conversation Tom's attorney has with him in the break that follows, is the thing that changes the entire shape of what comes next. They took a 15-minute break. It ran to 40. Layla sat in a small anteroom with her attorney and a paper cup of water that she didn't drink. Her attorney did not fill the silence with reassurance. She checked her phone, made one note, and said only, "We'll see what shape they come back in." Layla appreciated this. She had spent 8 years in a house where silence was always filled, always managed, always assigned a meaning by someone else. The quiet anteroom felt, improbably, like relief. When Tom's attorney returned, something had shifted in his posture. Not dramatically, he was too experienced for that. But the easy authority of the first 2 sessions had been replaced by something more careful. He sat down, reordered his papers, and said that his client had some concerns about the document's framing, that it represented, naturally, one perspective on events, and that context would be important in interpreting any individual entry. Layla's attorney said, "Of course, that's what the appendix is for." Tom's attorney paused. He hadn't gotten to the appendix yet. He got to it now. The appendix was, in some ways, the most devastating part, not because it contained the worst incidents, but because of what it demonstrated structurally. For each category of rules, Layla had documented not just the rule itself, but 3 additional columns: Tom's stated justification at the time, her response, and the consequence when she did not comply. The consequence column was the one that made the room go quiet, because it was never dramatic. There was no shouting, no violence, nothing a reasonable person could point to and say, "That, right there, that is the problem." The consequence column said things like, 3 days of reduced communication, resolved when I apologized, and Tom mentioned the incident to his mother without my knowledge, and he questioned whether I was doing okay to mutual friends for approximately 2 weeks following. Small things. Consistent things. Things that, individually, could be explained as personality or stress or just the friction of sharing a life with another person. But the column went on for 47 pages, and at the bottom of each page was a running tally. The tally was not Layla's emotional state or her interpretation. It was a count. Number of times the rule was stated. Number of times she complied. Number of times she did not. Average duration of the consequence period. Tom's attorney read the appendix for a long time. I want to stop here for just a moment. Because what Layla built, without planning to build it, without any legal advice, without even being sure what it was, is something that compliance researchers and organizational behaviorists spend years trying to document in institutional settings. She had created, from the inside of her own marriage, a behavioral audit. She hadn't called it that. She'd called it staying sane. But the document she handed across that table was not a diary. It was a data set. Tom spoke for the first time since the break. He said the document was one-sided. He said every marriage had friction, and cataloging friction without context wasn't a fair representation of their relationship. He said some of these entries, he gestured at the middle section, were from periods when he'd been under significant work stress, and surely that was relevant. He said he wasn't sure what the point of all this was exactly, if they were trying to be amicable. His attorney put a hand out slightly, in the practiced gesture of a man who needs his client to stop talking. Layla's attorney said, "The document isn't being introduced as evidence of bad faith. It's being introduced as a behavioral record. What we'd like to discuss is the application of the standards contained in it." Tom's attorney said, "I'm sorry, the application?" Layla's attorney said yes, and then she explained. The document, she said, contained 47 pages of standards that Tom had set for how financial decisions, social choices, family time, and personal communication should be handled within the marriage. These standards had been consistently applied, she gestured at the tally, for the duration of the marriage. Her client had adhered to them. What she was proposing was that the same standards now be applied to the division of marital assets and time. Specifically, that any personal financial decision Tom had made during the marriage without prior discussion with his spouse, any purchase, any commitment, any reallocation of joint resources, be reviewed against the $100 threshold he himself had established. She slid a second document across the table. 31 pages. Tom's financial activity during the marriage, cross-referenced against the rules in Layla's record. Tom's attorney looked at this document. He looked at it for a long time. Then he asked for another break. Tom did not look at Layla during this exchange. He had not looked at her directly since the first document landed. But as his attorney gathered his papers, Tom did something she would think about for a long time afterward. He looked at his own hands. Just for a moment. Just quickly. The way you look at something when you are trying to figure out how it did what it just did. The second break is where this story makes its turn. And what Tom's attorney says to him, alone in that corridor, is something we only know because Tom told it to his brother later, and his brother told someone else, and it got back eventually. It always does. Here is what Tom's attorney said to him in the corridor. He said, "The document is real." Not the events. He was careful about that because he was a lawyer and lawyers are careful. But the document itself, its existence, its consistency. The fact of 47 pages kept privately over 8 years by a woman who, by all available evidence, had never planned to show them to anyone. "That," he said, "is going to be very hard to argue against." Tom apparently said, "But it's just her version." His attorney said, "Yes, but it's her version with dates, and ours doesn't have any." That is the thing about a behavioral record kept by someone who was not planning to use it. It has a particular quality of authenticity that a deliberately compiled legal document never quite achieves. Layla's document had inconsistent formatting across years because she'd started it in a notes app and migrated it to a spreadsheet in 2018. It had a typo on page 12 that she'd never corrected. The early entries were shorter, more uncertain in tone. You could watch, reading through it, the moment she stopped second-guessing herself and started just reporting. These are not the qualities of a fabricated record. These are the qualities of a person who was trying to stay oriented in a disorienting situation. Tom's attorney knew this, which is why, when they returned to the room, his posture had changed again. He asked to discuss the second document. Layla's attorney walked them through it methodically. The $100 threshold, Tom's own rule, applied consistently to Layla for 8 years, had been crossed by Tom on 43 separate occasions during the marriage without prior discussion. The amounts varied. Some were small, a piece of equipment for a hobby he'd picked up, golf fees, a weekend trip with his brother that had been described to Layla after the fact as a work thing, basically. Some were not small. A car upgrade the year they were supposed to be saving for a renovation. A private loan to a friend, repaid over 2 years, that Layla had not known about until the friend mentioned it at a dinner party. Layla had known at the time that some of these things had happened. She had raised them gently as they occurred. Tom had explained each one, the timing, the necessity, why it was different from what she'd bought when she'd bought the coat without mentioning it. She had, in every case, accepted the explanation. Because you do. Because you have been trained to accept the explanation, and to understand that the rule applies differently depending on who is invoking it, and to feel vaguely ungracious for noticing. She had written them all down anyway. What's happening in that room right now is something I think a lot of people in long, asymmetrical relationships never get to experience. The rulebook, the one that was never written, never acknowledged, never named, has been written. It has been named. And it is being applied in both directions simultaneously for the first time. Tom is sitting across from the system he built and being asked to live inside it. The discomfort on his face is not guilt, exactly. It's something closer to disorientation. He built a house with a door that only opened from one side. He has just discovered there is another door.
The negotiation that followed took 3 more sessions. Tom's attorney was skilled enough to limit the damage. The second document was not legally binding as a standard for asset division, and both parties knew it. But that was never entirely the point. The point was what the documents, together, had done to the room. To the way Tom's confident opening position had quietly collapsed into something much more defensive. To the way the mediator now looked at Tom when he spoke. Not with suspicion exactly, but with a kind of steady attention that had not been there before. Tom made a counteroffer in the 4th session that was, by any objective measure, significantly more generous than his opening position. His attorney presented it with the careful neutrality of a man who had advised making it. Tom looked at the middle distance while it was read aloud. Layla listened. Then she asked for a day. She called her mother that evening. Not to discuss the offer, she had an attorney for that, but because she realized, sitting in her car in the parking structure afterward, that she wanted to hear her mother's voice. They talked for an hour. Her mother did not say, "I told you so." She did not say, "I always knew." She said at one point, "You sound different." Layla asked what she meant. Her mother thought for a moment and said, "Like yourself. You sound like yourself." Layla sat with that for a while. Then she called her attorney and said she was ready to discuss the terms. There is one more thing that happens. One detail from the final session that I have not told you yet. Something small and very specific, and exactly the kind of thing that doesn't make it into anyone's telling of this story, but probably should. The final session lasted 2 hours. The terms were agreed. The paperwork was signed in the order these things are signed, and the mediator said the things mediators say at the end of a process like this. And Tom's attorney shook Layla's attorney's hand with the professional warmth of a man who bore no one in this room any personal feeling whatsoever. Tom did not shake Layla's hand. He nodded, a small, contained nod, and then he gathered his things and left first. Here is the detail I told you about. The one that doesn't usually make it into the telling. As Tom's attorney was also packing up, he paused. He looked at Layla, not at her attorney, at Layla specifically, and he said, "How long did you say you kept that?" She said, 8 years. He nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they are filing something away for a reason they haven't fully articulated to themselves yet. Then he said, "Good habit." And he left. Layla's attorney looked at her. Layla looked back.
Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Layla's attorney said, "He's going to think about that for a while." She was right. Layla would hear, a year later through a mutual professional contact, that Tom's attorney had started recommending to clients in certain types of proceedings that they conduct a review of their own in-home behavioral patterns before entering mediation. Not as legal advice, just as prudence. Layla found this information both funny and completely unsurprising, which is, she would tell you, the emotional combination that lives at the end of most things like this. She got the house. She got the car that hadn't been discussed. She got a settlement that her attorney described as fair in the technical sense and better than fair in a few places that matter. Tom got a clean exit and the version of events he'd been circulating, though that version grew quieter over time, as versions without a strong document behind them tend to do. The first person Layla called after the final session was her cousin Bex. Not to report the outcome, she texted that, but to say something she'd been meaning to say for a while. She said, "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back." Bex said, "You're here now." And then she said, "I have a very strong opinion about where we should have dinner." And Layla laughed, really laughed, the kind that surprises you, and said, "Tell me." They went to dinner. Layla had the wine she wanted and talked until the restaurant was mostly empty, and nobody checked the time or tracked whose idea it had been to stay so long, or suggested afterward that she'd come back in a mood. She drove home alone at 11:30 and sat in the driveway of her house for a few minutes before going in, just to feel the quiet of it. Her house. Her driveway. Her quiet.
The document is still on her laptop. She has not deleted it. She doesn't think about it often. It served its purpose, which was never really the mediation room. Its purpose was the 7 years before that, when it was just her and the spreadsheet and the slow, steady work of trusting what she knew was true. Here's what I keep coming back to, sitting with this story. Tom never called it control. Layla never called it that either, for years. Because the word felt too large, too dramatic, too final for what was, individually, a series of small preferences. A $100 threshold, a raised eyebrow at a friend, 4 family visits a year instead of 8. What is that, really? What do you do with something that is never large enough to name? What Layla did was write it down, not as resistance, not as strategy, as sanity, as the only way she knew to keep hold of her own experience when the air around her kept insisting her experience was inaccurate. The document was not a weapon she built. It was a lifeline she threw herself. The fact that it turned out to be useful in a mediation room, that part surprised even her. This is the thing about patterns. They don't require your awareness to be real. They exist whether or not you have 47 pages to prove it. But the 47 pages meant that when the moment came, Layla didn't have to remember. She just had to hand it over and let the room go quiet. She already knew. She just needed something to show her she could trust it. If you've ever kept your own version of a list like this, even in your head, even without a spreadsheet, I think you already know why this story landed the way it did. Leave me a comment. I read every single one. And if this is the kind of story that you find yourself watching at 11:30 on a Tuesday because it sounds a little familiar, subscribe. Because Wettedy exists exactly for that 11:30 feeling. You're not alone in it, not even close. There's another story right here that I think you should see next. Same energy, different room. Watch it. I'm Hanni. I'll see you in the next one.